it's Lutherans or Churches of Christ, which is my spiritual home, or Baptists, or Uniting Church, or Salvation Army in various different states. And when I speak to teenagers, nobody sits in the front row. So this youth service, I feel quite at home, but none of you teenagers have sit here. Or maybe it's because of COVID that we do the space. No, I suspect not. As I was growing up as a teenager and into young adults, I also read that Melbourne prophet that we've seen today, Looney. And so thank you, Tina, for that Looney cartoon. And this is one Looney cartoon that the leaders of a church that I was the minister at, Northern Community Church of Christ, which was also 4 churches that came together and amalgamated in the northern suburbs of Melbourne. This was a Looney cartoon that we were talking about as the leadership of the church. I don't know what Looney had in mind when he wrote this cartoon. It was probably some deeply political or social insight. But I can tell you what we at Northern, in the context of coming together as one, what we were thinking about. We felt like our church was like that little cage where the bird is in. And we were looking over the fence to the northern suburbs of Melbourne and seeing enormous amounts of people over there that weren't part of our church, that weren't part of any church. And we kept thinking, now that we're together, we're 4 times as strong, we have 4 times the amount of people, 4 times the amount of resources. Now those birds of the air, those people operating in the community, will now come and join us in our little cage, our little church. What's wrong with the picture? What's wrong with that expectation of thinking that those birds will come to the cage? What's going on in the picture? The fence is in the way. Some of those birds wouldn't even see the cage, would they? And so we started to think, as leaders of this new church, now that we have more resources, perhaps we could serve the best bird seed. Or perhaps we could pipe in modern music into the cage, and then they would come. Then they would fly in and come to our cage. Or perhaps we could, heat the perch, or put some carpet around it and make it really comfortable. Would the birds come then? No, I don't think so. No, I don't think so either. And that's what we thought as the leaders of this church. Now, if we did improve the cage experience with better music, or maybe we could serve some really good coffee or some good food, there are a couple of birds that might be interested. Can you see them down the bottom there? That are intrigued about what is happening in the cage. But by the far majority of people in the community, we felt it didn't matter how better we made our church. Our programs slick up, our worship really good, preaching really better, songs and modern technology. Most of the people in the northern suburbs of Melbourne wouldn't even know we were there. And they certainly wouldn't walk in the door and sing our prayers and sing our songs and say our prayers, because it was so foreign to them, or they didn't even know we were there. You know, we felt like we could reach back into our experience of the past, back into our education, our experience of the way we did church, and make it better, and then people would come. And now we were 4 times the size, we had the resources to do that. And I remember saying, I feel, as a newly graduated, at the time I was 33, I won't tell you how old I turn next month, newly graduated, I said that the theological education that I've received is fantastic. But the church leadership, the church that I've been trained for, no longer exists. How do we sing the Lord's song in this strange land that we find ourselves in? Where we reach back into our past and we look at our education and we look at the experience of how we've always done church, and we don't know how to connect with those birds on the other side of the fence. or the people in the community of Whitehorse? What does it mean that we've now come together as 3 congregations and we have the resources of 3 congregations? Can we make an impact on the birds that are flying around and today would be going to sport, going to kids' sport, or going to their local cafe and enjoying good coffee and good food, or going for a walk with their family? How do we look over the fence and say, how do we connect with those people? And one of our leaders said something I'll never forget. He said, maybe it's not our task to try and invite and trying to be good here and get the birds to come here, but it's our task to jump the fence and create places of faith and spirituality and deep meaning and significance over the other side of the fence. We as a church have forgotten how to do that. Because everything that we did in the past, and it was appropriate for the time, everything that we did, whether it was sporting clubs or dances, or you did dances, didn't you? Right, I'm not talking to Baptists. Dances or meals or social activities, etc., was all designed because all roads led to Sunday morning church. And so we make Sunday morning church with Sunday school, and Sunday was set aside as the day when people were able to celebrate their faith and be in community with each other. And now the world's changed, and we know it, don't we? Yeah. Whether it's our friends, our neighbours, whether it's our children, whether it's our grandchildren, we feel a sense of grief that the birds on the other side of the fence don't want to come and join in something that is really important and really significant in our lives. They don't want to come and join in. We'll go to the next slide. The other prophet, of course, is Gandalf, wise Gandalf from Lord of the Rings. I used this cartoon last weekend in Adelaide and cheekily asked whether they'd actually got Lord of the Rings in Adelaide. You know, it's like a bit of a backward area of Australia. I don't think they were very appreciative of that comment. Frodo says, "I wish it need not happened in my lifetime," said Frodo. So do I. I'm not going to do the voice because, you know, that deep resonating voice that Gandalf has in the movies. So do I, said Gandalf, and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that we have been given. The people that walked along the Emmaus Road, devastated that the person that they had pinned all their hopes on was now dead, could echo those words. I wish we could never have seen such a time. The early Christians, as they grappled with being kicked out of the temple and grappled with what does it mean to connect with this Gentile world and move around the known world, convicted that Jesus wanted them to do it, perhaps they would have said, I wish we had not have seen such times. God has placed us in a moment in history where we don't know what to do. And that we as the church are no longer the powerful ones and are at the centre of society. I wish I had not lived to see such times. And yet just like the people on the road to Emmaus, and just like the people that formed the early church, and throughout history, whether it's Dietrich Bonhoeffer or Oscar Romero or Mother Teresa, or you can name them over and over, Martin Luther King, Desmond Tutu, they might have said, I wish I had not seen such times as these. But they didn't reach back into their past experience or their education. They reached back into the depths and the significance of their faith. We go to the next slide. Let me talk for a moment, and I'll jump back into what I just said. Let me talk for a moment why strategic planning in the context when our education and our experience means that we don't know what we're doing. Strategic planning, if we go to the next slide, the assumption of strategic planning is a little bit like a snooker table or billiards, if you like. And that is that strategic planning assumes that we know what the lie of the land is as it moves forward. And it's not changing, it's stable. Just like when we play billiards, if the table is stable and the holes in the table are in the right place and the balls are of the right size, we can just use physics to hit the cue with a certain pace on a certain point of the ball, and hopefully, if we're skilled, it will go into the pocket. Now transport yourself to a billiard table or a snooker table in a pub, and the level of the floor is not equal. The billiard table rocks a little bit. The velvet carpet of the table has been scuffed up after being used for so long. And just as you take your shot, somebody who's been drinking their beer bumps into you and spills their beer all over you. The assumption is, in that case, is that the ground we cannot assume is the same as what it once was. That's the sort of world that we live in. In order to develop, as once was popular, a 5-year or a 10-year plan, the assumption is that we know what is going to happen and what the world is going to look like in 5 or 10 years' time. I don't know about you, but when I grew up, the world was very different to what it is now. And I suspect in 5 or 10 years' time, because the rate of change is getting quicker and quicker, that the world is going to look different in 5 years and 10 years' time, and we cannot predict what that is. We go to the next slide. And so we need to form signposts. And Tina has started to talk about this, and I love the imagery of signposts because God is calling us in this time that we wish we had not seen, that we wish we had not been living in. God is still calling us, just as he called the early Christians. God is still calling us forward. We may not have all the details worked out like we do in a strategic plan, but there are certain things that we feel that God is calling us, so we can put the signpost in the ground and we can move along it and discovering Jesus not just with our heart and our mind, but with our feet. And sometimes that will be the right direction. Other times, perhaps as we move forward, we've got more clarity, so we can move back and we can just twist the signpost a little bit. Or perhaps we even want to pull it out and say, we felt that God was calling us that way, but we now see that God is calling us in a different direction. Next weekend, next Saturday, the church council, as you've heard, are gathering to discern their future. And they will once again hear my argument as I've been given to you, that forming a strategic plan that is set with the assumptions that I've been talking about just doesn't work anymore. But God doesn't stop calling us forward. And our task is to discern, what is God calling the Whitehorse Uniting Church to do? What are the little quiet promptings of the Spirit? And as a uniting church, you know this really well. We trust that prompting of the Spirit, that quiet voice of God calling us into the future comes from amongst us. Leaders don't go away like Moses and go up to the top of the mountain and then come down with the tablets of the 5-year strategic plan. The uniting church believes fundamentally, and other churches are following your footsteps as well, fundamentally that God moves amongst community. That's why you're committed to a consensus model of decision making. That's why the heart of the congregation is the most important component of the uniting church. And so where is God leading Whitehorse Uniting Church? What's the small prompting of the Spirit that you can hear? Because we can't reach back into our experience of being the church that was the powerful ones, that were at the centre of society, and people would move into the neighbourhood and say, where's my local flavour of my denomination, and I will go to church. because that's the centre of where I get my social needs, my physical needs in sporting groups, etc., and my spiritual, emotional and sporting needs. We don't know how to be church, how to be the people of God in this context. Our training, our education, our experience does not cut it anymore. And we're like the little man looking over the fence at all these birds in our community flying around and saying, why won't they come and be with us? And yet we've been given the resources of our faith. And God is prompting us. Almost sometimes I feel like God is yelling at the church. Listen. We go to the next slide. Discernment, Susan Beaumont says. You probably can't read that writing. I'll read it out for you. Susan Beaumont read this wonderful book called How to Lead When You Don't Know Where You're Going. And that's certainly how I feel at times. And so if you would like to read that book, feel free. She says, in a most general sense, is the capacity to recognise and respond to the presence and the activity of God, both in the ordinary moments and in the larger decisions of our lives. This approach to leadership presents unique challenges because it requires us to move beyond reliance on human thinking and strategizing to a place of deep listening and response to God within and amongst us. And let me tell you, the more skilled and the more successful that we are in strategizing and knowing what to do, the harder the task of discernment is. This is not to dismiss what human wisdom and strategic thinking have to offer us. Our ability to think things through and apply reason to our decision making is a gift from God. In other words, just like the early church did in being confronted with an experience of God through Jesus that they didn't understand, and a task given to them that they had no idea how to do, they reached back into the resources of our faith. So as that man was looking over to all the birds of the air and saying, why don't they come here? And thinking through, like Gandalf said, that if only I hadn't lived to see such times, our task is to reach into the resources of our faith and to hear God calling us forward. Next slide. A suggested approach, and you're going to get some handouts, and I apologise, the handouts, the writing is really small, but we're going to do it in this environment after morning tea. It's all right, you're going to get your caffeinated fix in a moment, just to keep listening. We're going to explore some of these questions. And if you might remember last time I was here and we were running a workshop like this, I just encourage you as you gather in your groups to spend a couple of minutes quietly jotting down some notes and then move into the discussion. This allows those external processes like me to be quiet for a moment and gather our thoughts rather than just speaking. And it also allows those of us who are internal processes, or perhaps more introverted, to also gather our thoughts. And then we can hear from the insights of everybody as we grapple with what's the small, quiet prompting of God asking where Whitehorse Uniting Church goes. So there's 5 questions. We're going to attempt to do 3 in the first group after morning tea, and then we'll do 2 of them excuse me, after lunch. Just the next slide. These are exercises that our muscles are not used to. I've recently... yes? Well, that's true. Okay, well, we'll look to you for an example. I must admit that I started running recently, and I went for a run yesterday, and I can still feel my muscles in my legs as I walk around. It's like learning to ride a bike. Initially, we can't do it. Well, the muscles that we're using as we go to the gym or go for a long walk start to get really stiff and sore the next day because they're not used to exercising in that way. this idea of slowing down and listening to the prompting of the Spirit and setting aside our experience of the past, our education of the past, feels really uncomfortable. That's okay. This is a step in the journey. You need to return to this time and time again. Be with each other as you attempt to exercise muscles that perhaps we haven't exercised before. There's one question underneath each of those questions, so if we go to the next slide. So what's going on? What's going on in your neighbourhood? What's going on in your church? So you're starting to jot down as many things as you can think of. What's happening in the neighbourhood? What's going on in our church? Perhaps things that we are trying to connect with our neighbourhood. Is it Centre 81? Could be one that you could put down, or there's other things that are happening in your church. Go to the next slide. God, what are you up to? How are we seeing God at work in our community and in our church? And then the third one, God, why are you doing this? This is the theological question. You're all becoming theologians for this little section. And it's asking, what could God's action in this new context that we find ourselves in be causing you to think differently about mission? We are products of what's called Christendom, of where the church was at the centre of society and the powerful ones. How can we think differently about being the people of God in this new context that we find ourselves in? We may wish that we have never lived to see such days, but that's what God is calling us to do. So we're going to do those in one group after morning tea, and then we're going to break for lunch, and then we're going to come back from lunch, if we go to the next slide, and we're going to look at two questions. How is the kingdom of God being expressed? What does the kingdom of God look like? And how does it challenge us to be church in this new context? I told you they weren't easy questions, and that we're exercising muscles that perhaps we haven't exercised for some time. And the last one is, God, what are you inviting us to do? What are you inviting us as Whitehorse Uniting Church to explore, to do, to track along the signposts, even if we're not sure? You know that gospel healing parable in John where Jesus touches the blind man for the first time and he can see people walking around as if they're like trees. And Jesus needs to touch the blind man again to see clarity of sight. Sometimes I think as we grapple with how to be church, how to be the people of God in this context, it's like we've been touched by God for the first time. And we're not seeing with clarity, but we're seeing some things, and we're able to define some signposts as we walk down. And then with our feet, we're able to ask Jesus, touch us again. That's our task for today. You're going to need some caffeine to get you into the mood for that. The church council members are going to come forward before morning tea and grab some forms. There's some for individually, and there's a group form. At the end of today, or at the end of each of the groups, if you would like to hand in your individual form, we would love that. If you don't, that's okay. But there'll be a group form that the church council member will jot some notes down of your discussion. Can I encourage you, given that you're an amalgamated church and you're still learning and getting to know each other, resist that temptation of moving into the groups that you're always in. You can do that over morning tea if you want to. Move into groups that you go, oh, I don't know that or that person that well. Move into that group, and then when you come back after lunch, move into a group that you weren't in that same group previously. Don't all go from one group to another, because that'll mean that the same group of people are together, but you get the idea. And you may be teenagers and not sitting in the front row, but I'm sure you'll work it out. So, church council members, if you could come forward, and let's go have a cup of tea, a cup of coffee for about 15 minutes. And if you haven't finished your cup of tea or cup of coffee, I'm sure you're allowed to bring it in here. Is that right, Tina? Yeah. Maybe not. Okay. We don't know. Make sure you get a cup of coffee or a cup of tea.